Look, guys, I've made over 800 videos on my channel. We're coming up on 900 pretty soon. And you know what's amazing? I said this to Melissa the other day. I don't think there's a single political position I've adopted that I now regret or would retract or change. I don't think there's anything I've said about politics on the channel that I look back on and feel ashamed of. Once in a while, there's a video and I look at the title and think, I bet I regret that. And then I click on it and I watch it and I say, no, I still agree with this. I totally support this. That happened to me a couple days ago with one that had a pretty provocative title. But no, it made some good points. Now look, I'm going to talk a little bit about communism and how we perceive communism, sort of deeper, profounder issues as such, which will interest me if I come back and watch this video 10 years from now and I've forgotten the context in which I made this video. But I do need to open this video by speaking specifically about Mexi, one of my fellow YouTubers and a fellow Canadian vegan Buddhist YouTuber, or at least she used to be Buddhist. She used to identify as Buddhist, right? Maybe now she's in the ex-Buddhist club along with myself. We don't know. She deleted those videos. And that to me is also a question mark. I wonder if that's because she got deeper and deeper into hardline communist politics, which is what she identifies with, and she decided that she was on the side of the people like the Maoists, like Mao Zedong, who persecuted Buddhists and burnt down Buddhist monasteries, and that it wasn't so cool for her to have these videos up in which she possibly identifies with Buddhism and talks about Buddhist philosophy. I don't know, Mexi, you tell me. It looks like you changed your view on that. But look, change is part of life, and if Mexi does change, I welcome the change. It may be that she at some point reconsiders her flirtation with hardline communist politics, and if so, that's all for the best. You know, I've said that about people who subscribe to and preach many unsavory, ideologies on the internet. I don't think this is like a tattoo that you wear for the rest of your life. It sounds to me like she's someone who's toying with a lot of ideas she doesn't really understand and a lot of history that's soaked in blood, and she's doing so in a really insensitive and crass way that she should reconsider. But if she does reconsider, it's all for the better, and I'm happy for her. Look, guys, in terms of what I've said thus far about Mexi, please just do that most basic thing that sympathy demands and imagine that the positions were reversed. Imagine if you had discovered a YouTuber's comment on a channel that had videos with men in balaclavas, men pointing rifles, a channel actively endorsing terrorist extremism. Now, as it happens, the channel where I discovered Mexi's comments was endorsing violent terrorist extremism of the communist kind, especially of the Maoist kind. What if it was fascist extremism? What if it was right-wing paramilitaries? What if it were neo-Nazis? What if it was ISIS? What if it was Muslim extremism? What would you think if it wasn't Mexi? If it was someone who identified as a moderate Muslim, but then you find them on a Muslim extremist YouTube channel, a channel that openly endorses and making the kind of comment Mexi made. And what kind of comment did Mexi make? Mexi identified herself with a specific political school of thought within communism in the context of a discussion about what kind of communist she was or what kind of communist she aspired to be. That was the conversation. It was a fair conversation for them to have. So there were basically like 3 communists involved in this discussion most directly, and other people comment. It's YouTube, it's an open forum. And within that conversation, she identified herself specifically as Marxist-Leninist, Communist Party, Marxist-Leninist. Right? Now, there's a big gap there. There's an incongruous contrast between her saying that in that context, with that meaning, and what I see on her YouTube channel, which she makes a video about her ideological identification, and for the first 10 minutes, she just completely waffles and obfuscates, and then concludes by saying that she refuses to answer the question, that she's not going to identify with any particular ideology. And she sent me a reply on Twitter today, on my time zone it was today, probably yesterday where you're at, saying that she's just a non-sectarian leftist, that i.e. she's not particularly communist or anything else. Okay, well that's quite a contrast. That's quite a contrast, Mexi. Please think sympathetically how you would regard that. I wouldn't make excuses if I found a right-wing vegan who, let's say they were moderately right-wing on their own channel. They explained their position as moderately right-wing, but then I see them on an extremist channel a channel that endorses extremism, that's playing you these film clips of the extremists with the rifles and the balaclavas on and so on, making that comment, explaining where they identify within right wing, or if we're a Muslim on a pro-ISIS channel, etc., etc. I'm not making excuses for any of these ideologies. These are all ideologies with fundamentally violent philosophies and an enormous body count. Now, we live in a day and age in which people get fired from their jobs, especially school teachers get fired from their jobs over Facebook comments, over Twitter comments. We kind of have a running series of these cases in Canada where people post something vaguely racist, vaguely right-wing on Twitter or Facebook, and then they're fired from their position or they're suspended or asked to resign or what have you. It's a real question we have to ask as a society. It's a series of very uncomfortable questions that forces us into. At what point is something sufficiently racist or sufficiently right-wing to justify a person being fired? You know, is there a category for moderate neo-Nazis that are acceptable in society? Most people say no. They say absolutely not. There's no moderate fascism. Either you're a fascist or you're not. Well, why is it that we have such a vague and permissive category for moderate communism? I really want to ask that question. I really want to ask it seriously. Why? When someone reveals themselves to be a neo-Nazi, when someone reveals themselves to make excuses for the terrible atrocities carried out by Adolf Hitler in the past, we care about it not because it subtracts something from the past, but because of what it adds to the present. We care about it because it tells us something about who you are, what kind of person you are morally and ethically, that you would make excuses for these regimes, that you would say these things about these atrocities, right? It's a character judgment on the person here and now. And it matters in terms of its bearing on their future conduct, ultimately, right? So are you going to tell me it's no big deal when Noam Chomsky justifies and supports and makes excuses for the Pol Pot regime in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge, Democratic Kampuchea? I have an earlier video of that on this channel. Are you going to tell me it's no big deal when Slavoj Žižek says things in support of Lenin, Stalin, Mao Zedong? Some of you watching this video may not understand the gravity of a person identifying themselves as communist, Marxist-Leninist, specifically as Marxist-Leninist within the communist tradition. I'm going to break it down for you real quick here. When somebody like Mexi says that, what it means is that they reject revisionism. It means that they reject the period of relative optimism that happened under Nikita Khrushchev after the death of Joseph Stalin, when Nikita Khrushchev basically stood up for the Russian people and said, look, it's okay to admit that there were terrible mistakes, there were terrible atrocities committed under Joseph Stalin. It's okay. We don't have to lie to our own children anymore. I'm not going to force you to pretend that nobody who was sent to the Gulag was innocent. We can sit down, we can have a moment of national mourning and sobbing and admit to ourselves that untold millions of people were killed, in many cases for just no particularly good reason at all, but in some cases due to ethnic cleansing, in some cases due to ideological persecution, etc., etc. I mean, to make a short list of reasons why people were massacred under Joseph Stalin, hard to say. Nikita Khrushchev, one of the leaders of Russia after the death of Joseph Stalin, he stood up and made this statement, and Mao Zedong turned on him and said, no, you don't. Mao Zedong said, that's revisionism, and revisionism is evil. And within China, they commenced massacring everyone who was revisionist, everyone who was pro-Russian, including many of their best technical experts who had flown to Russia, been educated in Russia, and flown back to China, by the way. It was a disaster. But this began the persecution of anyone who was pro-Russian within China, by the way. This was the anti-revisionist campaign. And this created, around the world, Marxist-Leninist parties within communism. They identified themselves as Communist Party Marxist-Leninist because what this meant, this is a coded term in effect within communist ideology, is that they supported the continuity, ideologically and tactically, and in terms of violence and massacres and everything else, that goes from Lenin to Stalin to Mao Zedong. They were rejecting the revisions that were being introduced into communism by Nikita Khrushchev. They were rejecting the relatively mild and moderate form of communism that Nikita Khrushchev was just kind of trying to espouse, right? Nikita Khrushchev was in power for about 9 years. Then he was removed from power, and the only little light of hope in that incredibly dark, regime, tyranny, went out. Okay? I'm not saying Nikita Khrushchev was a good dictator. In some sense, there's no such thing as a good dictator. But of course, the contrast to Joseph Stalin is tremendous. If you identify as Communist Party Marxist-Leninist, this is not equivalent to someone identifying as a neo-Nazi. It's equivalent to someone insisting that they are a Nazi, a classical Nazi, in contrast to a neo-Nazi. I have not insulted Mexi by pretending that she doesn't know what she's talking about, when she, in that context, in the context of a YouTube channel that openly endorses and supports armed revolution, terrorism, hostage-taking, kidnapping, violence, the most brutal kind, by men in masks, men in balaclavas with machine guns. That's the channel she made that comment on, where she identifies not just as communist, but as Communist Party Marxist-Leninist. I'm not going to insult her intelligence by pretending that she doesn't know what she's talking about when she says that in that context. That is every bit as serious as someone saying, no, they don't consider themselves a neo-Nazi. They consider themselves very specifically a hardcore, hardline, classical Nazi who rejects the revisions of a later period of perhaps more moderate fascism, if such a thing exists or ever existed. Just to keep the parallels straight here. All right? It's true, not everybody should be fired for every inappropriate Facebook comment. That's not what we're debating here. What I'd really like my audience to consider is, when you make these kinds of excuses, whether you make them for Mexi, a vegan YouTuber like myself, or you make them for Noam Chomsky, or you make them for Slavoj Žižek, really challenge yourself. Would you make this excuse for a hardline Muslim who flirts with ISIS? Would you make this excuse for a hardline right-winger who flirts with fascism or Holocaust denial or neo-Nazism? Would you? If not, draw this same line now against communism. I've got to tell you, I would not want to be a member of any vegan organization in Canada that includes hardline communists. It may be a very difficult distinction to draw. It may force us to ask ourselves difficult questions. But I'd much rather ask those questions now than be in a position down the road where we have vegan political organizations that are dominated by communists. That was exactly the situation I was in the Green Party in Canada, where I had an allegedly ecological party that was dominated by hardline communists and far left-wingers, rejects from the NDP, who were too far to the left to participate in any mainstream politics, and people who did, to various extents, secretly or publicly, endorse violent revolution.